So again, thanks very much. We are starting with the editors to introduce the book. Thanks very much again to Maria and Marsha.
Thank you, Paolo, very much for inviting us. And it's really great to see all the authors together. So I'd like to start with a very brief introduction to the development of the book. And the book is the outcome of a session I organized back in 2017 at the annual conference of the Association for Art History, which was convened at Loughborough University by Marsha and other colleagues. My session was called Home, Exile, and the Politics of Belonging. And I was very much interested to explore how the concepts of home, exile, and belonging can be used to understand contemporary art practices. And I remember at the time, I received so many interesting abstracts, and I knew from just reading the abstracts that the session would be a great platform to discuss and reflect on art and migration. And indeed, we had so many lively debates at the conference, not just during the panel, but also during the coffee breaks, during breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So it was obvious that there was a need to develop further our discussions and what we were discussing in relation to home, homemaking, and the sense of belonging. Although the majority of the essays in the book originated as papers presented at the conference, we also included some essays on projects that we knew would fit very well with the theme of the book. I will now hand over to Marsha, because I know she has lots of interesting things to say, and then I'll start because I have the first chapter, so we'll come back to me.
Right, thank you, Maria, and thank you very much to the organizers of this for inviting us. We really appreciate it, and we also thought that it was you have a fantastically interesting project, and so we're interested in the dialogue that might emerge between the issues in the book and your wider convened project. Maria said something quite straightforward, which is that, you know, this book and the inception of this book very much came from her work and her desire to convene a session at the Association of Art Historians to look at this, and it really is very much a project that fell under work that she had been doing for some time, thinking a lot about, particularly about the border and the very heightened border that exists sometimes in very particular places, Cyprus, Palestine, and so forth. And drawing from that and moving to this notion of belonging and this idea of the way in which the arts operate, this project kind of emerged, and she invited me to get involved as a co-editor. And I have to say, I've been, it's my pleasure to have been invited to be more involved in this project. This is an area that I've worked in for many years, particularly on women, the arts and globalization, questions around the cosmopolitan, questions around migration, and a notion of post-migratory studies in relation to the arts. And so it's very kind of key that way. And I think in terms of thinking about this particular book and the amazing, extraordinary range of essays that eventually kind of comprise this text, I think I'd like to sort of lay out sort of maybe just two thoughts, and maybe we'll return to them as being ways we might think about this. The first one's quite straightforward, and that is that migration, the notion of human movement in a very broad sort of sense, is not an anomalous circumstance or situation. It is not as though actually most people are fixed in place and that somehow in some strange way a few tiny instances of migration occur, but actually migration is part and parcel of human cultural movement and change. And it is, demographers and geography will tell you that we are living in a time when the vast majority of the populations across the earth would be able to either say that they themselves or within 2 generations of themselves had experienced migration. So migration is a status quo in some senses, and the sense that we need to start thinking much more strategically about how we look at that as a process that is very profoundly impactful on human life is quite significant, I think, now. And within that practice and project, this idea of home becomes quite key. And what I want to kind of suggest is that we have too often tended to imagine that home and migration are somehow in opposition. But in actual fact, what I'd like to suggest is, and you know, increasingly, if you look at the notion of the way in which the ideas are emerging across the arts, humanities, social sciences, in actual fact, home and migration are two parts of the same process, and we should be more often potentially focusing on an idea of homing, on the idea of the processes by which one makes oneself at home in a world of movement and change, than thinking of the idea that home is sort of blood and soil, that it's fixed, these kind of rhetorics of home being some kind of absolute position of fixity, but rather that we are always having to recreate home, that we are in processes of, as Scheller and Ahmed would call it, uprooting and regrounding, that we actually operate through homing. And that, in fact, once we start thinking about homing and migratory movement as being quite the typical basis of human culture, then we begin to start thinking about how we might get those processes right. It is really important for us to think about how we work through notions of homing in the current climate. Many instances of migration are enforced migrations or have been enforced migrations. Some of them have come clearly from, you know, widespread colonization and so forth. Some are opportunistic, some are pleasurable, desirable movement. But through all of those things, people have to in some way negotiate a place to inhabit the world together. And the processes by which we might think about how to imagine and inhabit that world together, share that as both a human and a non-human sense of homing, is quite sort of significant. So I'm really interested in the idea that we would think of some verbs here around homing, as opposed to, and think about a process and a practice rather than a place, a fixed locus. And the other thing about this is, and I guess it's kind of a disciplinary point, which is that I think the arts are really quite crucial for this. And Paolo, you've already sort of suggested that in your starting point, but I would reiterate that the arts are not an afterthought in relation to the processes of homing, that actually creativity, the way in which we tell stories, the way in which we use objects, materials, images to try to make ourselves at home, to try to negotiate the distance between the past and the present in homing, our memories, our futures. The way in which we do that is very visceral, it's very affective, it's really quite powerfully about imaginative qualities that are often artistic. And in this book, clearly a range of different practices being thought of as that way. But rather than imagine art as somehow just sort of a representation of the real, or, oh, well, here's a film about migration, to actually think about the arts as being quite profoundly a way in which we articulate the very processes of homing, the way in which we understand ourselves to produce the notion of homing. And I'm really interested in the idea that the arts also provide the possibility of a prefigurative politics of inhabiting the world differently. So if we want to think about different ways, you know, that are beyond just colonizing or whatever, but we want to think about how hospitality or how generosity or how a cosmopolitan notion of homing might now begin to be understood. The idea that we have a prefigurative space for an imaginative entertainment of those ideas through the arts, ways of storytelling differently and moving forward, become quite significant. So the migratory condition and the importance of homing and the sense in which the arts are key seem to be quite critical. And the essays in this book do that in an incredibly wide span. So I'm quite excited by that. And we're going to look now to go through, and we are joined by many of the authors who will talk briefly about their own work. And Maria's essay opens the volume. And so I'm going to turn back to Maria now. And thanks everybody for inviting us.
Thank you, Marsha. So yeah, as Marsha said, chapter 1 is my chapter, and the title is Weaving Together Narratives of Home, Exile, and Belonging. So in this essay, I explored 2 projects that were exhibited in the International Art Exhibition Documenta in 2017. The first work is by Greek Cypriot artist Vasia Vanesi, and the title of the work is Weaving Together, the Grid of Memory. The second work is by Palestinian artist Emily Jassir, and the title is Memorial to 418 Palestinian villages which were destroyed, depopulated, and occupied by Israel in 1948. I have chosen to explore these two works because they reflect in an evocative way the complexities of belonging, exile, and returning in Cyprus and Palestine. If you're familiar with the two countries, you will know that they share some similarities in terms of their experience of exile and belonging. Both countries have experienced wars and are under military occupation. Both Cypriots and Palestinians were forced to leave their homes, and decades later, they're still not allowed to return to their homes. They also share a powerful quest for return to their place of birth, their home they grew up, and where the families are originally from. I found from my research that for people in Cyprus and Palestine, their lives and sense of belonging is complicated in similar ways. So I argue in my chapter that these two works can be understood as politicized projects of belonging. In their works, both artists have invited communities to participate in the making of their works. Vanessa, which is the first image at the top and the right side one. So Vanessa, for her projects, she invited people to gather every Friday and weave together, and this was during the Documenta. Over 60 people participated in the process of weaving, and during the project, participants had the opportunity to listen to a narration that the artist had pre-recorded, where she spoke about her experience as a refugee and the memories she had from the house she was born. And we can see a photo from the people who were weaving at the time, and at the same time they were sharing stories and memories. And there is also a photo of the complete work, which includes some words, and some are in English and some are in Greek. And those words are memory, power, pain, breathe, together, alive, safe, life, dignity, and tears. All these words were the reflections of the participants after listening to the artist's narration and after talking to each other. And what is really interesting is that this project provides a space to emphasize experiences from a woman's perspective. And this is very important if we consider that in patriarchal societies, histories are generally written by men and do not differentiate experiences by sex or gender. Now, moving on to Jassir's work that she prepared in 2000 for an exhibition in New York. For this project, the artist bought a family-sized refugee tent and stenciled the names of the 418 villages which were destroyed in 1948. Similarly to Vanessa, Jassir asked for help from the community, and this resulted in over 140 people visiting her studio in New York. And the people helped with stitching the names of the villages onto the tent. And they did this while listening to traditional music and sharing stories of these villages. The actual making of this work is very important because it constructs a politicized narrative of home, a home that in some way exists only in memories and references to a past historical event. If we consider that these two works have been exhibited in international exhibitions, then they also become platforms. And these are very powerful platforms to introduce to audiences histories and experiences they might not be aware of. For example, what has happened in the past in these two places and the ongoing and current occupation of both of these homelands. So this is a very brief summary of my chapter. I analyze more and I unpack the projects and the way in which the two artists use powerful metaphor to represent exile. And if you want, I can talk more about it later in the question and answer time. But I realize that we do have a very specific time limit for every presentation. So we can move on and perhaps we can come back later. So our second presentation is by Lydia.
Thanks, Maria.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about my chapter, which is based around the work of Photiou, and I look particularly at how she uses textiles to materialize beauty and pain within her work. So this sort of stems from my research looking at the convergences between transcultural encounter and textiles, and whether or not we can use textiles as metaphor for unpacking ideas relating to migration, and as Marsha sort of said, the post-migratory approaches within art history. So it's sort of broken down really into three sections where we look at different textile techniques or ideas. So the first is very much based around this idea of entanglement and almost merging together of motif, and you can see that really clearly in Photiou's early work, Eshlimi, where she uses sublimation print to sort of create these very, very dense decorative textile furnishing booklets, and you can see this in the top left. So she's sort of using subversive coding here, so we can see weapons and genitalia sort of arranged to create these really ornate patterns. And she continues this sort of entanglement of motifs to create different forms in her later work, the Papillon collection. So that's the image directly below. And here she's really sort of bringing together traditional Persian miniature ornamentation techniques with German Klexographian or blotto elements that came out of a European perspective, and she plays with this sort of cultures. So entanglements. Sorry, yeah. So entanglements actually a really important idea for considering sort of cultural connections and interactions, and Glissant, Edouard Glissant often refers to it within his work. So that's sort of the first perspective. And then moving on to sort of the slightly later work, we've got Weaving Pain, and this is where sort of ideas relating to weaving and post-colonialism really come to the fore. So I sort of draw a convergence between the work of Breinig Lersch and Helmbrecht Breinig and Klaus Lersch, sorry, and weaving, where they look at transdifference. So they're looking at how different ideas relating to different cultures are held together in a complicated nexus without ever sort of being resolved. So this idea that competing or slightly conflicting ideas can be near each other and sort of interconnected, but always remain independent. And this sort of shines through in Photiou's work here, because we have the repeat motto of the sort of blotto, Rorschach, the tradition of blotto and parlour games coming from a European perspective, intertwined with this really dense Persian ornamentation tradition. So she's bringing the two together, and they're never truly sort of they're distinguishable, yet they're connected and create a whole. And Joanna Inglot, in relation to this work, talks about how both this work with its sort of this imagery, which is including depictions of extreme torture, it represents both Iran and the theocratic regime, but it's also a response to sort of the abuses of power at the hands of Western governments, including the UK and the US. So we've got, you know, in Guantanamo Bay and in Afghanistan. So it's sort of reflecting that we're not just looking at one culture, that actually there are similarities between both. So it's this sort of simultaneous representation of sort of conflicting ideas. And then the third sort of textile technique, which I sort of consider in relation to Photiou's work, is appliqué. So this is in her final piece. This is just one of the banners. It's one of 8 pieces, and they are appliqué Ashura banners. So these banners come from their commercial banners that are used as part of the commemoration sort of mourning ritual for Muhammad's grandson. So this is an annual event. And what Photiou has done is she has taken these banners, cut them up and subverted them to sort of create really flirtatious posters. So each of the sentiments in the banner actually says, "Kiss me," which is sort of a nod to the democratic era in Iran, and a song that was played during the Mossadegh era, and that was Mara Bebus, or "Kiss Me." So it's got this flirtatious undertones, and so in doing so she's sort of subverting very modern Islamic ritual practices, and then linking it back to the past in Iran as well, and where it's been. And yet to an audience today, we look at these especially non-Farsi speakers, we look at these banners and we can't really interpret the wording, yet each of the banners does sort of signal to "kiss me." And as Medya Farzen has sort of outlined in her analysis of the work, actually this "kiss me" sort of acts on another level as well, because we have the teenagers who are attending these sort of commemorative mourning practices, and they're using them, thanks Marsha, using them to actually interact and flirt with one another. So to cut it short, looking at appliqué, I draw on sort of the work of Mary Louise Pratt and how she's using appliqué to select and adapt and put forward and conceal different elements from her culture, and revealing that to the rest of the world. So it's all about hiding, concealing and revealing. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much, Lydia. So next we have the presentation by Nadia.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So thank you to the organizers and to Marsha and Maria for making this possible. It's actually quite exciting in the middle of everything that's going on. Some exciting news to see this coming to shape. And it's so exciting as well that it's such a mix of disciplines as well, trying to look at this idea of homing and belonging and exile and how things come together. But so in tune with what has been talked about until now, my chapter talks about the artist Remedios Baro, who, if you don't know, was born in Spain in the region of Catalonia in Girona, and traveled to Mexico in the 1940s due to obviously the political unrest in Europe at the time. And she made her life in Mexico, and she clearly expressed she didn't want to come back to. There was nothing to come back to, no, in her own country. And it's interesting because when I started looking at what should I write for my PhD, now feels like so far away. I was thinking of like how I left my own country because I wanted to leave my own country. But then when I came back to my country, it was so traumatizing because everything had changed so much. So obviously I was looking for this on how to look at these. And of course, she talked to me, but Baro's paintings kind of spoke to me from that perspective, like what do we do with what has happened when we're not there anymore, with that gap between what we have in our imaginary or what it was and what it is right now. And it's traumatizing. And then what do we do to deal with it? No. So my chapter, which is chapter 4 in the book, talks particularly about this book, La Creación de las Aves, the creation of the birds. And this is one of the most famous paintings by Baro. And so therefore it was quite challenging for me to take it on because there was so much already being written and said about it, but I was pretty sure that I wanted to be my number one as I move forward. Because why? So this painting was done in 1957. In 1957, Baro was after traveling to Venezuela after being in Mexico. And she more or less talks about this period of her life as a period of stability, where she was settled and doing what she wanted to do, which was painting. So which seems to suggest that she was more or less in a stable moment in her life. Therefore, if we're looking at the process of homing, or the process of building or making your space as your home, I was thinking this was a really clear indicator of, if we look at this in detail with a magnifying glass, what are we going to see more than we actually see? And therefore, this is what the chapter is about. I kind of defragmented every element, and I looked at every single thing that I could have looked, and I discovered a set of things, which some of them have already been mentioned before, which is obviously the ideas on the cosmos and the role of the creator, also the feminine space that we see here with these earthy, fertile browns and oranges, but also the idea of interconnectivity, which, interestingly enough, Lydia mentioned in her presentation. And yes, as we see here, we see these oval-shaped in-creator being fooled by the cosmos, maybe the stardust, we don't know. And in terms, is creating these birds which come to life as well and become part of the space, no? As well as the main figure being in transformation or mutation itself. So I definitely not follow what I had planned, so please apologize. I just get carried away with this painting. But so what have I done? I've explored these processes by looking at it from a phenomenological and humanist geography kind of a perspective. And I'm talking namely of theories by Johanny Payasma, Sarah Ahmed, Terkenli, Alain de Botton, Rossi Braidotti, and Guy Foutuan. So there's a few names there, which made, I think, the reading quite different to what has been written about La Creación de las Aves. We also discovered ideas of space and that transformation of space, but also ideas of time, as she perceives time as this pause moment of creation, pause movement, and we see that process of creation is not just painting. It's actually, it involves an imaginary itself on how we take spaces, we take our memories, and we put them together into one creation. Could be a textile, painting, or fabric weaving, and we transform it into our own experience, but at the same time relates to its viewers. This is what she's doing here, because we see things that are familiar to us, and we don't know why this is so familiar. And this is basically what my chapter is about. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Now, next presentation is by Imogen.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. And I'm really interested in hearing all the other chapters as well. But my chapter, Identity and Not Belonging, Art and the Politics of Britishness in 1980s Britain, takes the exhibition From Two Worlds of 1986 as a starting point to consider identity and belonging in 1980s Britain. It discusses the debates around and infrastructures underpinning the emerging artists living and working in Britain who were part of the post-colonial diaspora. While these debates were not well developed, from the mid-1980s, the situation was starting to change, and again, these changes are discussed. From Two Worlds was a major exhibition that was initially shown at the Whitechapel Gallery in East London, and was one of the very few exhibitions of the time that showed the work of artists with non-European backgrounds. Britain at the time was politically conservative and divided, and the art market was not developed, but was being heavily promoted around particular groups, including New British Sculpture. Those that were not part of these groups were marginalised. As has been articulated by a number of critics, including Eddie Chambers, the separate spaces, cultural expressions and channels for Black creativity indicated, quote, the extent to which Black Britain was somewhat separate and different entity to the rest of Britain, end quote. Stuart Hall wrote that the meaning and identity are constructed through what is included within groups and what lies outside those parameters. One can only be constituted through the creation of the other. At the time, the definition of Black was broad, and as I discuss, what was shown in the exhibition was also very diverse. There are two images that I've got here, Rashid Areen's Look Mama Macho and Veronica Ryan's attempts to fill vacant spaces. And they're both exhibited, but they show just a bit of the diversity, and there was much, much more diverse than that. And what it shows is that, you know, they were both about their lived experiences, but they draw on very different cultural backgrounds and address different concerns using different means. And while the aim of From Two Worlds was to, quote, broaden cultural consciousness and pose questions, end quote, about how we regard the world through the way which an artist with plural cultural experience can give expression to his or her vision, the sheer variety exhibited demonstrates that there is no simple other or simple reasons for artists to make their work. However, the networks and debates were growing during the 1970s and 1980s. The Black Art Gallery, the 198 Gallery, and the Keskadi Theatre Workshop were some of the venues that catered exclusively for Black art. These initiatives received institutional and government funding. While these and the developing infrastructures were important, they also emphasized difference. As Rashid Areen argued, the term Black was not about any cultural, economic, or political affiliation. There was no understanding of differences within the categories, and without recognizing the hierarchical structures that determine cultural difference, it is impossible to account for the almost total exclusion of non-Western artists from the history of modern art. While From Two Worlds was it contentious, 50 artists did put forward their work to be exhibited. There was a real attempt to include the artists in the organisation and the planning of the event. By the 1980s, there were many artists working in Britain from non-Western backgrounds who had received few opportunities to exhibit. It was a time of real social and political conflict and much racism. And while the exhibition could not solve these, From Two Worlds was an attempt to ask what it meant to be British from the point of view of people from non-Western backgrounds who were living at the intersection of different cultural identities. These issues are even more relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imogen. So next, it's chapter 6, where we have 2 authors, but unfortunately Basha was not able to join us, but we do have Alexandra. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, and thank you both, and to Paolo and our hosts as well for hosting this incredibly interesting event, and obviously to Maria and Marsha for including us in this very exciting book. Okay, so Basha sends her apologies. I've taken some notes with her. And I'm not going to attempt to summarize the chapter because in some ways it was an experiment in writing. So I'm afraid if anyone continues to be interested in it after this, they would just have to read it. Our text touches on one of the many things that Basha and I share, our experience of migration from Poland in her case and from Greece in mine. The text is also a document of our travels at the time to South Africa and Australia, for academic conferences mostly, And it speaks to the conditions of transit, documenting the pressures and interruptions of being away from home, but also the strange lucidity of the traveler. So being away sort of, gave us the opportunity, although we're very busy, it also gave us the opportunity to look at some familiar things differently. Our habitats both shelter and imprison us. Being away is both an inconvenience and a liberation. It is an experiential and personal document made public, as well as an academic consideration of the book's main themes: art, transnationality, domesticity, and their transformative interface in and through feminism. It was made possible, this chapter, by our mutual commitment to claim time for each other at a very busy time, as well as for the preparation of a publication. In this sense, it is also a document of feminist friendship and a speculative thinking towards a project as yet unrealized. Basha and I curated an art exhibition in 2018, Home Strike, which reconsidered feminist approaches to domesticity in art, and to which we still hope to return one day. So after all this time, the project that we're talking about in the chapter remains unrealized, but it's our white whale. We're still planning to go back to it. Basha and my engagement with the epistolary form exceeds this chapter. In my case, it evokes one of the first art projects I ever researched as a PhD student, the Women's Postal Art event, also known as Feministo, that has shaped my approach to art history in its deliberate and daring conflation between art, friendship, and politics. And for Basha, the epistolary mode manifests in her current project with Astrid Corporal, called Love Letters, a virtual platform for creative correspondence based on the spirit of solidarity, freedom, and love. The project supports the All Poland Women's Strike, both politically and financially, through the sale of commissioned editions by participating artists. And if I have a little bit of time, just to explain my slide really. So some of the works shown here are by artists who were included in the first iteration of our exhibition Home Strike at L'Étranger in London in 2018. So we included Paula Chambers, who's here in the middle with feminist clutter, which explores a variety of feminist themes, including a preoccupation of homemaking, but also more equivocally, it sort of populates a space with a variety of women with guns, both real and imaginary, both idealized and historical. And Małgorzata Markiewicz, here represented with like a little sticker that she made back in 2017, where the situation in Poland regarding women's rights and abortion, access to abortion particularly, was much better than it is today. So it's gone, as I'm sure all of you know, much worse now. And Basha and I in the chapter are discussing a transnational expansion of this project by the inclusion, for example, of Sarah Waters's work that explores the domesticity of her own family's sort of settler colonial roots and the extractivism that typified it really, and considers ways of repairing that through art and within art practice as well. And finally, Senseni Marasela, whom I met while Basha and I were writing that chapter in South Africa, explores an aspect of apartheid really that many of us not from South Africa may not be aware of, that has to do with enforced internal migration, both for work, but also to escape imprisonment and because of imprisonment, and the impact of that on one's experience of temporality and family and personal life. So through this character that she's sort of invented and partly based on her own mother, Theodora, she explores waiting as an activity that is really eviscerates one's own sense of temporality and is an aspect of apartheid and in some degrees post-apartheid South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. So next we have the author from chapter 7. And hi, Eva.
Hi, thank you. Well, my chapter is Crossing Literal and Conceptual Borders, Nepantla Practices of the Borderlands in Performance Projects by Guillermo Gómez Pena. As indicated by the heading, my main theoretical departure is two concepts, borderlands and Nepantla. Borderlands refer both to a border region and the understanding by Chicana theorists as a psychological space from which to acknowledge difference, accept contradictions, and construct identities that transgress singular identifications. Nepantla is a Nahuatl term going back in time to the Aztecs in the 16th century, describing their experience of being in between, living within two different cultures by being colonized by the Spaniards. Chicana theorists understand Nepantla as the capacity of double vision and as an alternative space that can be transformed into processes of meaning-making and healing. Guillermo Gómez Pena was born in Mexico in 1955. In the late 70s, he crossed the US-Mexico border on foot to study visual art at Cal Arts. He has since been located in California, working in performance groups such as Poiesis Genetica in Los Angeles, the Border Art Workshop in San Diego, and Pocha Nostra in San Francisco, where he still resides. From his rich creation of performances, the chapter brings forth a selection that is organized into 4 themes. One theme is the migrant body with solo performances Mexican Homeless and Loneliness of the Immigrant, both enacted in LA. The second theme is the border crossing body with performances by the Border Art Workshop. 2 of these were enacted together with Emily Hicks, Border Wedding at the US-Mexico border, and Tijuana Niagara at the US-Canada border. A third theme is the caged and crucified body with 2 of his projects. Crucifixion Project, initiated and staged in San Francisco in collaboration with Roberto Cifuentes, and 2 undiscovered Amerindians visit the West, that is often called The Couple in the Cage, and that was initiated in collaboration with the Cuban-American performance artist Coco Fusco and staged in 9 cities on 3 continents. A 4th theme is the body as map for interactive rituals, focusing here on one project by Pocha Nostra, Mapa Corpo, Interactive Rituals for the New Millennium. This project was initiated in 2003 as a response to the war in Iran, with the intention of exploring relationships between national borders, international conflicts, and the human body. In a first version of the project, the bodies as human maps were staged by male performers, including Gómez Pena. In a second version, the bodies were staged by female performers, since, as stated by Pena, geography has been feminized. In a third version that you see here was the extraction by the audience of flags from the performer's body, supplemented with the ritual cleaning and shaving of the body, and with writings on the body of poems of hope. I conclude that Pena's performances along these four themes articulate Nepantla practices that include aspects of living at literal and metaphorical crossroads and creating alternative spaces in the borderlands, of double vision, seeing place and time to multiple identifications and several perspectives simultaneously, and of psychological, spiritual, and political processes of meaning making and healing. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And then we have our finalist presenter for today, which is Aliyah. And Aliyah wrote chapter 8 of the book.
Yes, hello, thank you. Yes, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this today. Yes, in my paper I use one artwork, the one you see on your screens, as the sort of starting point, unifying point to discuss issues about land, belonging to land, but also who the land belongs to. And they all seem to come back to revolve around the image. One of them, a lot of them, they have this tension, which is starting in the Soviet period, which Kazakhstan was part of the Soviet Union. And during this period, there are several things which changed dramatically. For example, the end of nomadism, those traditional agricultural practices, which is, of course, was linked to ability to move freely and creation of borders, but also enforced sedentarization, so ended up that. Also, the actual creation of borders, so when the borders were drawn and therefore sort of nations were defined by these new borders, which were drawn by someone who was in power, and of course migration, which was some of the migration was for labor and some for agricultural purposes, and other migration was into Kazakhstan into labor camps, and so basically, which created a completely multi-ethnic society, multi-religious society, which by the end of the Soviet Union, so in the 90s, when the borders opened up, some reversal of this process started. But also the fact that the society was so mixed and was becoming less mixed provoked the new questioning, the new search for history. So to define what is history, how is it linked to this land, or it's not linked, and also what is traditional. And of course, when questioning tradition, straight away, one of the main sort of how do we put the tradition together with the contemporary realities? And one of the biggest tensions is quite often the gender issues, and so simply the gender roles, the binary gender roles, but also the sort of the non-binary, the existence of other, of other interpretations of gender. And of course, all these things are linked again to migration, because, for example, I'm taking the example of several artists, including this artist Almagul Minlibayeva, who have in recent years migrated out of Kazakhstan and have settled in Western Europe or in the UK. Almagul is in Berlin, for example, and not surprisingly, perhaps, looking at all this, what's happening, all of them are female artists, so women artists. And but in their artworks, they, for example, as the one we see here, they come back to questions of gender. They come back to questions of how this gender is interpreted in tradition. And not in this work, but in other works, there is a very important looking. The very big factor is looking at land, and some works, for example, look at who land belongs to, who can make decisions about it, but also the environmental impact that of this human consumption. And it goes back to Soviet use. For example, there were nuclear test sites in eastern Kazakhstan. So for over 40 years, it was there were testing happening there. And there's the destruction of the Aral Sea. And so these are sort of multi-country, so regional issues. So they cross borders, but also they're directly linked to land. And this is changing now in the recent maybe 5 years, but also the question of this migration of artists, but also migration of art. In the early 2000s, most of the major exhibitions of Kazakh art were taking place abroad, and which also gives rise to questioning what image is presented, or what messages are included in this art. And for me, it's not even like a circle, this whole sort of process, this whole sort of looking at this artwork and looking at all these questions, for example, gender, ethnicity, identity, history, and environment, and each one seems to be circling around this link to borders and this link to land, but also all of them, sort of almost like fractal organizations. They all come back to each other. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Aliyah. So we have completed now all the presentations. We have additional 2 chapters, but unfortunately the authors could not join us today.